Hello, I'm Alex Bellinger, and this is Small Biz Pod on Thursday, the 28th of July. Coming up in today's show, we've got a great interview with Phil Crowshaw, who is not only a business trainer and consultant, but the brains behind Experts Online TV. We'll be taking a look at the anatomy of successful entrepreneurship with Phil, who has gained a great deal of experience both working for successful entrepreneurs and interviewing them. Okay, so I think we all would like to know the anatomy of a successful entrepreneur. What makes the Richard Bransons, the Anita Roddicks of this world tick? What makes them stand out? How can we emulate them? And what are the traits that we can develop either in training or that we need to bring out of ourselves in order to reach that level of entrepreneurial success? Well, one man who was fascinated by this subject is Phil Crowshaw, who is a trainer and consultant, but also runs Experts Online TV, more of which later. He, a couple of years ago, set out to research the secrets of success, particularly of successful entrepreneurs. And I'm very pleased to have Philip on the show today to give us some insight into what he found. Philip, hello.
Hello there.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about you first. What's your background, Phil, and when did you decide to branch out on your own as and run your own business?
Well, my background is very corporate, actually. In the early 90s, I headed up communications for Thomas Cook. And in those days, I was also quite a big fan of personal development. I was one of these people who was very ambitious and keen to get on and always keen to get to the next promotion. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I would go on seminars and listen to tapes, specifically from a company called Career Track, who at that time were North America's largest training company. Mm-hmm. And an opportunity actually came up for me to go and head up sales for that organization in the UK and Europe, which I subsequently did. So I went really from an operational role in terms of looking after communications into the hard area of sales. Yep. And marketing. Mm-hmm. And then after about a year there, I decided that I'd do a really big kind of wacky thing and give up a good paid job to travel the world for a year. Read one of those books by Chris Turner called Born to Succeed. Yeah. And he suggested if you really want to widen your understanding of the world, then go around it. Yeah. So suddenly I found myself with a backpack on my back and set off around the world to find out how it ticked. And that was just obviously a fantastic experience, learnt an awful lot, and in effect really was able to read all those books that we all plan to read but never do because we don't really have the time.
Sounds like a great opportunity.
It was absolutely marvellous, and I think what was interesting about it was not just what you see in terms of the beauty of the world at large, because of the dolphins playing in the sea, but also what was fascinating was the psychological things that happen to you. You know, the kind of things where you can be actually sat on a beach in the most beautiful part of the world in Hawaii and still feel a bit depressed and still wish maybe you were back at home with a few of the lads in the pub having a pint. Yeah. And that was quite a strange, and there's almost a guilt trip occurs at that point because you kind of feel guilty that you're so fortunate to be in this beautiful part of the world that people would die for. Yeah. But psychologically, you still feel a bit down or a bit depressed, and that was quite fascinating in terms of that. And I'm sure many of your listeners who've done it will know what I'm talking about there.
No, absolutely.
And then I came back thinking that will I ever work again? What will people think? In fact, I didn't give up a good job, and I'm now traveling around the world. I've traveled around the world, but it was exactly the opposite. And when I went for interviews and I came back, most of the people that interviewed me were more interested in my travels than they were in my background career.
Yeah, I think that kind of experience is just invaluable for building a rounded human being who's going to contribute to an organisation, whether that's a large corporate or in terms of setting up and running your own business.
Well, that was very, very true, and obviously if you think about all the different skills that you need in order to get yourself around the world in a year and come back with all your bits intact, A lot of it is all those areas. You've got to be good at planning, you've got to be good at organisation. You've got to be confident, and because it builds confidence, because you have to be confident because you're on your own in effect to a point.
Yeah.
Albeit, I'm not the greatest person for not having creature comfort. So I have to say I did splash out at numerous points in the journey in hotels and what have you. So I did it the easy way, not really the hard way in truth.
Okay.
So then I came back and I then became customer services director for the Cordwell Group. Mobile services phone company, one of the biggest independent companies in the UK.
Yeah.
John Cordwell is the billionaire who runs that, and I'm sure a number of your listeners will have come across John in various press articles.
So I remember seeing his search for a member of his management team on TV.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So that was when I really got into customer services and back into, if you like, corporate life.
Mm-hmm.
So it was whilst I was there that I really started to really get interested in the whole area of success, particularly looking at how John Cordwell had, in effect, within a 15-year period, gone from a second-hand car salesman in Stoke to being worth 980 million at the last count. And that just fascinated me in terms of what he'd done, how he'd done it, and it was really there. I was really starting to think about how people become successful.
Yeah. No, interesting. So, obviously, over the period of time that you've looked into the subject, and I know Experts Online TV continues that exploration, if you like, of what motivates and inspires people to succeed, like John Caldwell. You've put together a kind of 12 key elements that in your view create success, particularly for the entrepreneurial. What do you reckon are the most important of those, or is it the whole package that is the essential?
I think it's the whole package. I mean, what was interesting was that in terms of the background to this was that because I was intrigued by this whole success question, I decided to go out and interview as many high-profile people and general experts in their fields as I could, in order to try and determine, what the pattern was or what the system was that they were using.
Yeah.
And I think the difference that's nothing unusual about that. But perhaps the difference was I decided to actually film these interviews, and then I decided, well, if I'm going to film them, the internet's growing like crazy. Broadband was clearly developing as well. So I thought, well, why not put these interviews onto the internet for everybody in the world to watch and listen to and experience for themselves. Yeah. But obviously, as part of that process, I was digging around and looking for patterns and looking for consistencies that seemed to come up time and time again. Whether it was Sir John Harvey-Jones or Simon Woodruff, Anita Roddick, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, as you quite rightly say, we came up with, in effect, what were the 12 components. I think looking at it from both the interviews that we did and from my own experiences in my career, I think all 12 components are absolutely critical to success over time. Yeah. The first component starts off with motivation. If there is perhaps one of the most important, it's probably that first component, which is the motivation. Yeah. And the reason for that is that many people will say they'll do things, but they never carry them through. If we went into the pubs and clubs around the UK on Saturday night and found out how many people were going to start businesses and how many do, there's a very, very big difference. Yeah, absolutely. And fundamentally, the reason for that is quite simply the strength of motivation to see it through.
And motivation to start is one thing, but certainly I found, and I'm sure it falls into the pattern that you've identified. One of the hardest elements is maintaining that motivation once you've started. I think very often people are very enthusiastic to start and run their own business, but it's when you start coming up against the inevitable ups and downs of entrepreneurial life that your motivation needs to be at its peak.
Very, very much so, yes. The interesting thing, though, is if your initial motivation is strong enough, then it kind of gives you at least a fighting chance.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then throughout the whole process, all the entrepreneurs, without exception, came up with this this thing about persistence.
Yeah.
And a number of them called it. Sahar Hashemi, who set up Coffee Republic, talks about it as the persistence test.
Mm-hmm.
And you're tested in that persistence test throughout the whole process.
Yeah.
But if your motivation, your core motivation to get to the end is strong enough, you will then see it through, and you will somehow find the strength to overcome those barriers and those issues and those challenges.
Absolutely. Now, sorry, Phil, one of the things that that interests me is, in terms of motivation, what exactly is the motivation? Is the motivation the same for all entrepreneurs? Is it to make a lot of money? Is it to sort of a personal sense of achievement? Is it profile and kudos? What is the motivation, or is it a combination of things?
It's a combination, but when I started the process of interviewing these people, I made the assumption, I should never assume anything, but I made the assumption that it would be the 60-foot yacht in Monaco, the Ferrari.
Yeah.
It wasn't at all that. There were two things that were driving people fundamentally. One was the freedom to choose. It was huge.
Yeah.
And I know myself, and maybe even you can relate to this, is that freedom to choose is sometimes a bigger driver in some people than others.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can be in corporate life. You do, frankly, no matter what anybody says, there are times in your corporate career where you are arguably bullied. There are times in your corporate career where politics are driving everything rather than what is in the best interest of the organisation.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that a number of your listeners are actually nodding away there.
Yeah, I imagine so. Yeah.
Yeah. So freedom to choose was huge, absolutely huge.
And Anita Roddick was one of the people you interviewed, and she said something quite interesting on the subject of freedom.
Entrepreneurship is about freedom, about the obsession of being free, about being master or mistress of your own, life and your own identity. Attached to that, a huge work ethic, which immigrant cultures have. My parents were, Italian economic immigrants, and life was no more complicated than love and work. And you worked from 10 years old, working our mum's calf, and so on and so forth.
So, Phil, what were the other areas that were significant?
The other area was fear, and their drivers were not 60-foot yachts. Their drivers were survival.
Mm-hmm.
But what was interesting is that their motivation, once survival was covered, in other words, their financial security was looked after, then lots of other things started to come into the equation. Then it was about making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was about changing the world.
Yeah.
So once their physiological needs were looked after and met, i.e. they had a roof over their head and food in their mouth, and children were clothed, then all of a sudden the motivation for more psychological and spiritual issues would increase significantly.
Now, I know one of your interviews, Simon Woodruff from Yo Sushi, said something quite extraordinary about fear as being a motivating force. So here's Simon.
Well, first of all, I think that making £1 million isn't difficult at all. I think making £5 million is difficult, but making £1 million isn't that difficult. I think pretty much anybody's got the capability of doing it. I think you've got to be desperate, though. And that you've got to just sacrifice everything, literally, I would say, and be prepared to do whatever it takes, and obsessed with getting it done and all of that. And if you've got that kind of desperation, so you need to kind of put yourself right on the line. I don't think that as human beings we do really difficult things out of the desire for great pleasure. We do it out of the fear of great pain. So if you're in a war, you don't go and kill a, machine gun nest because you might get the medal at the end. You do it because if you don't, the whole thing's going to fall apart, and you feel this weight of responsibility and all of that.
Okay. Philip Crowshaw from Experts Online, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.